This is Beyond the Weekend, a podcast of Cornerstone Church, where we dig into the things we didn't have time for on Sunday. Welcome to BTW. Welcome to this week's episode of Beyond the Weekend. I'm Mandy Fowler. Today I'm being joined by Pastor Alex Fernandez, who's our pastor down at Heritage Hill campus. And when I said down at, it's downtown. That's what I meant. Welcome.
Thank you.
We record this in one take, folks, in case you wondered. There's no editing here, so it's all raw conversation. We are on week 9.
Can you believe it?
I know. We have 2 more weeks left, if you were wondering, on the Sermon on the Mount. And we finally entered into chapter 7, which is the famous, so many parts of the sermon are famous, but the famous passage about not judging, about the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and the plank in your own eye, which I think we've all heard sermons on over the years, but we found some great insights in the passage, I think. So let's talk about judgment. What's the hardest part about talking about judgment?
I think one of the hardest parts of talking about judgment is kind of what are we talking about?
Right.
You know, is opinion the same as judgment? Is accountability the same as judgment? What is judgment? And walking this line of observation in other people that we tend to move towards. And I think the hardest part of judgment, to answer your question, is the willingness to focus on myself.
Right.
Because when we think about judgment, we think about opinion, we think about accountability, we always think about the other person.
Yes.
Whoever that person is. But as Jesus brings up this topic, you know, he shifted in as we move to chapter 7 in these next couple parts that we're going to talk about this week and next week about what does a community of disciples look like living this together.
Right.
And he points it back to me.
Yeah.
That, you know, and one of the main points of the message is in judgment, I have to acknowledge that I am in desperate need of grace. Mm-hmm. And so that's the hardest part of judgment is the willingness to look inside. And that's what he's forcing us to do in this passage is to do some hard self-reflection or examination. He uses some harsh words
right.
in his analogy to do so. But I think our tendency is to deflect.
Yeah. We always want it to be about but what about that guy?
Right.
Which is not dissimilar from last week talking about enemies. You know, we don't want the spotlight to be on us, you know, we're like, what about that guy? What about what he's done? You know, and we're just kind of constantly, I think Jesus intimately knows us and that's woven all through this sermon, just like how well he knows humans.
Yeah.
And our tendency to, I don't know why, what is it about judging that we just love?
There's I think it's comparison.
Yeah.
I maybe inside of all of us we're wired and we, even in our view of God, maybe we just is he grading on a curve?
Right.
Is there a minimum threshold?
Yeah.
How can I move up the ladder to get further up the scale? You know, and so I think in judgment, I think also at the core, you know, we can recognize things that are not good. Mm-hmm. You know,
yeah,
and sometimes those things,
yeah,
and those things maybe become more obvious in some people, and we see it, and so we want to call that out. So the challenge that in this text, though, is as much as we want to deflect, Jesus is boomeranging that reflection back. And he's forcing me, the person who's observing something in somebody else, to look at myself and realize maybe a blind spot that I have.
Right.
That to him may be really obvious.
Right. Yeah, he's really saying, take a look at yourself. He's not, and to be clear, because a lot of times, and we did hear there was some pushback at one of the campuses, at least just from someone saying like, well, does this mean, you know, great. So anybody can just let anything slide,
sure,
you know, and whatever goes, anything's good.
And I think my answer to that would be there are certainly passages in Scripture, Paul writes about it, that teach us how to approach people with accountability. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about Matthew chapter 7 and these verses,
right,
that's not what Jesus is talking about.
Right, he's not.
So as much as we'd like to deflect to that other conversation, we're addressing what Jesus is trying to address here.
Yeah.
And that's me.
Right. Which is great. And it reminds me of a story that I've shared before on the podcast. So apologies, but I just think it's so helpful. revealing something about humans. It's an anecdote. I wish I could remember where I found it, but somebody went up to a pastor and said, "Hey, I think you should be preaching more about sin." And the pastor said, "Great, what's your sin that I can preach about?" And they were like, "I don't want you to preach about my sin." Oh. I said, "Well, why do you want to hear a sermon about someone else's sin?"
Because I want to compare my sin to theirs.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And I think that's natural. And I think the deeper thing that Jesus is getting at, as I said in chapter 7, it's to become the kind of community that Christians want to be a part of, and non-Christians, by the way.
Right.
Like, what kind of people are you going to be? How do you live in harmony with one another?
Yeah.
And so we started off with the research of the Barna research and the Pew research that's gone on for the better part of 15 years that give us a stark view, kind of a startling view of what non-Christians think of Christians.
Right.
I don't know. Personally, I'm not surprised by the things that I see in there. Okay.
Yeah.
And but they should be surprising.
Those. Yeah. Well,
they might be offensive even. We should take offense to them, that we're judgmental, that we're hypocritical, that we're too political.
Yeah.
And in recent years, hateful, anti-gay.
Yeah.
I mean, none of that is good. Mm-hmm. And so, the joke in the research that I read is 10 of the top 12 were negative, which means number 12 was positive. Because otherwise, why would you use that math?
Yeah.
And the other
Nobody talks about the top 12.
And the other one wasn't even the top 5. And so, if that's a perception of Christians out there in the world, that has to come from somewhere, and I said this myself. I don't think that describes me. The Christians that I know, I don't think it describes them, but that's the perception. So that's what people are seeing. And I think that perception comes from being judged.
Yeah. Well,
whether personally or through media or other ways, there's a messaging that's getting out that maybe isn't the message of Jesus, but it's the message of judgment.
Right.
Judgmentalism.
Right. Well, and that brings to mind a good question, which is, how can we possibly change that?
Yeah. We were wrestling with that as we were talking, and I don't know that I have the answer to it, but I think one answer to it is, if we see judgmentalism within Christianity, I think that's certainly helping slant that view. And, those surveys, as many times as you take it, I don't imagine it's going to change if that's what's being projected out there. So the answer to that can't be passive.
Right.
It just doesn't mean be quiet and don't judge people who are judging, especially Christians. It's not don't judge. But what would it even mean to be anti-judgmental?
Right.
That in an active way, people have to start to experience anti-judgmentalism from Christians to change that perception.
Right, which is so challenging. Well, I loved the point from the message about, people don't get judged into change. And I would, that's so true. They get loved into change. Yeah. So we can start with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, there in that one, I think the motive has to be asked. If I'm being judgmental, is the true motive behind that because I want to see life change in that person? Or is it more selfish that I want to compare myself to that person? Why am I being judgmental about that person? Do I care? Do I have a relationship with that person? It's easy to be judgmental with people you don't know. Right. And again, we're not talking about that necessarily in this scripture or in Jesus' context. He's talking to followers living in community with followers, brothers and sisters.
Brothers, brothers and sisters.
And so I think the important part of that is if we can't practice that within the church, we have no hope to practice that. Like if we don't treat Christians without judgment, I don't know if it's possible, but if we can't at least practice that, then what hope would we have to practice that externally?
Right. Well, and I think it really does start, like we can begin to practice anti-judgmentalism in our own hearts, it requires a lot of self-awareness as you're looking at somebody, you're thinking, you realize what your thoughts are about them. And this doesn't mean we can't think, I don't know if that's the most fruitful way to go about life. You can still have these opinions and thoughts, and there's plenty in the Bible about using discernment and wisdom and all of that, but that we're interrogating kind of what's going on in here. Am I thinking of that person with disgust, contempt? Am I like, that person is awful, like I don't care to know them?
They're not my brother or sister,
right? And that's where I think, and that's incredibly convicting for those of us who are taking this very seriously. And, we see plenty to disagree with in culture of like ways that Christians are doing things. And sometimes the most vocal Christians are the ones that I'm most frustrated with, because it's like, wow, that does not sound like Jesus to me. And that's okay. I think that's okay to think those thoughts. It's just paying attention, being mindful of what's going on in my heart towards that person.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah, I'm wrestling
I think so.
with it. Yeah.
No, I think so. And within the church, being willing to have tough conversations about topics we don't agree with.
Yeah.
Being in community with people, and even here, just, I guess, the spirit of humility. You mentioned that one earlier. Curiosity.
Yeah.
Asking more questions than making statements and forming opinions about people.
Yeah.
Trying to have different perspectives or gain the perspective of another person.
Empathy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then at the end of that conversation, maybe not changing my mind on what my belief is or my stance is on something, but also not leaping to what you just said. And that is, you're a bad person then.
Right.
Or you're not welcome here, or those types of things. It's like, are we open to the diversity of thought as a church? One of the things we've been talking about for the last couple of years is navigating the messy middle.
Yeah.
In all of the things of church, where we want to be a community of people where we don't all think the same thing. We're united in what we believe about Jesus, but we may not agree on every topic. But we're okay with that. And do we invite that? And how do we practice that? And how do we let the community know that? And how do we invite more people to be a part of that community? Because that's hard work.
Yeah, it's very hard work. We would prefer not to do it.
Right.
Really, if we're given the choice.
But I think that's a truer reflection of what the kingdom of God looks like.
Absolutely. Well, and so that's where, so then once we move out of, practicing this and being aware of what's going on in our own hearts, then to get to a place of moving that outside, like you said, it doesn't do any good if we just are quietly not judging.
Yeah.
How do we move the anti-judgmentalism into our Christian community, so that it's impactful on other people and it starts to produce change? I don't have an answer.
You have to be, well, I think some of it, I don't either, but I think we have to begin to practice those things external.
Yeah.
Of the church as well, in your work environment, in your social circles, putting yourselves in place where you're maybe not comfortable. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's just, are you experiencing different people?
Right.
I don't necessarily know what that all means.
Yeah.
Specifically as a task to do for somebody, but it's practicing what we do internally and showing that collectively as a church, so that people look at Cornerstone and people of Cornerstone and they go, well, that's, I might think of that about Christians, but I don't think of that about those Christians. Right. We can't worry about what the perception is of all Christians.
Yeah, we can't control that.
But we can certainly control the perception of we Christians. And so in our community. And how
people experience us. Yeah. 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 Well, it is very hard. And I think it's hard to make these, we can't make these blanket pronouncements about this. It really comes down to the day-to-day life. And I think trying to understand where people are coming from really is crucial, because we can say, I wouldn't do that. Yeah. That person is, what a waste of time, or we just make these judgments so quickly, and to work that into, help me understand, what do you love about that? Right. I wouldn't be caught dead. Whatever it is. I don't want to say something that's but help me understand why you spend all your time and money doing that. Just to become curious. I think I liked that about what you said earlier, and that is, it's time consuming. Yeah. But I think that's what's going to start producing fruit. Because if we just avoid, we don't want to become people who just avoid conflict
That's
or
not what Jesus
avoid
is saying.
people who are not like us. Yeah. So once again, we're Jesus is inviting us into a hard thing.
I think Jesus is also inviting us to what's your starting point? Assume first I have a plank in my eye,
Right.
even though that person I see has a speck in their eye.
Right.
Assume first that I don't know why that speck's in their eye, or what their perspective, or whatever,
Right.
or how it got there. Assume all those things first. Approach that person with curiosity more than opinion.
Right.
Approach that person. It's kind of the end of we didn't touch about this in the sermon, but the end of this passage ends in verse 6, and it's like this whole. It's like 2 sentences, but it's the most confusing parable that Jesus tells in this whole entire sermon.
Yeah.
And he talks about, dogs and pigs and, all this other stuff. And I don't know if you have it.
I have it. I'll read it.
Yeah.
Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces.
Wow.
Yeah.
The riddle.
Let's close in prayer.
All right. So, and for any of you dog owners, I'm a dog owner. What does your dog love? Treats, right? Yeah. Like, so if I came home and I gave my dog my laptop. He greets me at the door, and literally we have a dog, and every time we come home and he's been home, he's home all day. We give him a bone, and it's right where the cupboard is.
Yeah.
And before he goes out to the bathroom, we know, and he knows, I go to the cupboard first, I get my bone, and then I go out. But that's how he greets us. And so if one day I come in and I don't do that, and I give him something else instead, right?
Yeah.
I take out my laptop and I, whatever.
That's valuable.
Valuable, but not to the dog.
Right.
Don't be surprised if you're met with question or even hostility. And the same thing with pigs. Well, like giving a pearl to a pig, what's the point? And so what Jesus is getting at here is like our approach matters. Like if I'm judging you and I come up to you and I say, hey, and I say something that could be very judgmental in my approach with you.
Yeah.
Don't be surprised if that person tramples over me and, and returns my
tears you to pieces.
Tears me to pieces because of what I just said to them.
Yeah.
It's what does that person need in that moment? And giving them what they don't need, criticism, harsh words, whatever it is. If you approach them in a way that they don't receive it well, don't be surprised if they trample over you and just respond with even higher level of, it gets back at the message, you wrote a few weeks ago, and the response, our response is to escalate. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And that's what you can lose control of it quickly. And so that's what Jesus is talking about at the very end here, as he's talking through, he is helping us understand how to approach. And the approach is not to give something to a person that is not of value to them if we want value back.
Right. Which I think is very instructive for us, again, because, Jesus isn't talking about, I feel like I just see a lot of Christians spending time judging what's going on in culture, other non-Christians, people outside the church, and judging their behavior. And, and I understand there is a lot to be distressed about in our world. And I'm not saying it's wrong to observe those things, but we're spending so much time, just lobbing judgment and vile words, hatred, at people who are outside the church or we have no relationship with, and expecting that to somehow bear fruit, that people will be like, oh, you're right, I should start following Jesus, in response to that kind of treatment.
And I go back to what's their motive? Do they even want to see that person change, or do they just want to hear more people agree with them?
Right.
Right. It's kind of that comparisonitis that we get caught up into, like, oh, let me point out something that really I don't like in culture.
Yeah.
Who else likes my statement?
Right.
And then I feel good about that. And then we all feel good about that because I pointed out something that is out there. But am I pointing that out so that I hope life change happens in that person?
Right.
I don't see that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they don't.
Right. Well, no. Well, it brings to mind also the message from many weeks ago, which I believe you also wrote, the one about murder. Like, pat yourself on the back. Congratulations, you didn't do that one. And that's kind of what I see, kind of going on at the heart of judgment is like, we're just wanting to pat ourselves on the back for what we're not doing.
Yeah. I use the illustration of, and I kind of did believe this to a certain degree. I've never thought about it to this depth, but as I wrote it, it's kind of when I'm judging, and I think I'm judging with Jesus. I see him on my shoulder, and I'm like pointing it out, and he's like, "Yeah, I never thought about that." And I'm like, "Yeah," and they're doing this, and he's like, "Yeah, that's a good point." And this. And he's like, "I never thought about that." It's like I'm convinced that Jesus is shoulder to shoulder with me, looking at that person in disgust or in contempt too. And the startling thing in this passage is like Jesus might be looking at that, and he's not ignoring the speck because he calls it out. He's like, there's a speck there, but he's like, but maybe you should be more worried about the plank in your eye. Like, do you even see the plank in your own eye? And before you try to pull the speck out of that person's eye, maybe we should work on that thing. Right. It's again deflection.
Yeah.
But it's not how I view judgment.
Right.
Because I can feel self-righteous about something. I think I'm in full alignment with God.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that God maybe isn't displeased with that too.
Right.
But my response in judgmentalism doesn't solve that.
Right.
And that can be as ugly as what I see.
Yeah.
And so, Jesus is, again, he's like, let's bring it back here.
Right.
Let's work on this first. Let's start there. And then, is your desire to help that person grow? Then let's recognize we're all people with planks in our eye. And let's recognize we're a community of that. And because of Jesus's grace, he doesn't judge me because of that.
Right.
And so maybe how I pay that forward is maybe I don't judge others.
Yeah. It's making me again think of the enemies passage from last week, which is in chapter 5. So we put them back to back, but they don't belong there technically. But this idea of like, you're so concerned with out there, what someone else is doing and like what is made possible by what you can do, and so you might yell, point out they're wrong till you're blue in the face and it may make zero difference.
Right.
But you have control over yourself.
Exactly.
And your own heart. And if that's what you can spend your time and, your prayer life and your concern, if you can spend your time on that, that is going to be fruitful. Yeah. That is a promise.
Yeah. And I think that takes us back to what you said here in the beginning is, Jesus is pushing us to do that so that we become a community of believers that people want to be a part of. So let's imagine a place, a church, a community of people that are really good at doing some self-reflection and self-examination and just, not being obedient to God because you have to, but because you want to.
Right.
You just can become a better person. We all just become better people individually.
Yeah.
We just become better people collectively.
Right.
And then more people want to be a part of that.
Right. That's appealing.
That's appealing. Yeah. Like who doesn't, hey, I've got a community of people who are really judgmental. Why don't you come and join us? Well, okay.
Ooh,
I like being judgmental too, but
yeah.
Or I got a really welcoming group of people that I'd like to be a part of.
Yeah.
We don't agree on everything.
Right.
But, we love people.
Yeah.
And so we'd like to invite you into that.
Right. Yeah, that's appealing. That's something that people want. And it's something that sets apart the world is an incredibly judgmental place. That is the law of the land. That's what people are used to. Yeah. And so if we're not doing something different, it's not going to drive.
And isn't that what we're finding in culture is that people are moving towards the voices that are the same voices in their head. Our media is moving to that. Our algorithms that we have in our social media and our other news outlets just becomes an echo chamber of the same stuff. We start getting attracted to the same kind of people, and you're getting, that's not the kingdom of God.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
No, culture is waiting to see like what actual difference does Jesus make in your life, and if all we're giving them is the same, they're not gonna want to come in. They're not going to want to join us. So, I mean, there's a lot at stake. We're going a little long, but, this is an incredibly rich conversation. I do want to add, because I can hear the people, I'm I'm a rules follower. I'm a person who's, you're just saying that anything goes. And I don't, obviously that's not what Jesus is saying. But as far as we're not the judge, he is, you know? And so we don't have to, we can just let
James.
go of we can let go of the reins.
Who are you to judge? James.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. We can just trust. It takes trust.
That, yeah. Do we, I guess that's a bigger thing. Judging somebody is wanting to decide good and bad, innocent or guilt, all that kind of stuff. Do we trust that God is a just God?
Yeah.
That really he'll deal with it however he deals with it. I don't know how he deals with it, if it's in this lifetime or the next.
Right.
We want to see judgment and we want to see consequences. But maybe we should be more concerned about our own.
Yeah.
I think that's what Jesus is saying.
Yeah.
Let's start there.
Yeah.
And when we get that right, then maybe we can start to help others.
Help other people.
But help other people.
Right. With that motive. And that becomes our motive, I think, as we become more mature and our hearts kind of become soft.
Yeah. Are we spurring one another onto growth?
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to end. Thank you for joining us. We hope you are continuing to catch the sermon wherever you can, even if you're away on the weekend, as we know many people are on these gorgeous Michigan weekends now. You can find us on YouTube, on our website. You can listen to the podcast version on Apple and Spotify. So continue to catch up with those, engage with the Bible reading plan, the message discussion guides. We're trying to offer a lot of tools just to help us wrestle through these hard passages together. So thanks for joining me, Alex.
Love it.
And we will see you next week.